Welcome to the Platinum Freight Podcast with Peter McRae, a podcast for business owners sharing the latest news and tips about customs clearance and freight forwarding. Welcome to episode 12 of the Platinum Freight Podcast with Peter McRae, Customs Broker. In this episode, we'll be discussing the topic of importing jewellery to Australia. So, Peter, let's start with an overview. What are the main methods for importing jewellery to Australia, and how do each of these methods work?
We commonly see that jewelers or individuals will import jewelry via different methods, and those methods could be, the first one would be via the postal network, which means that somebody overseas has posted the goods at their post office, and then those goods will arrive into Australia, and then our postal network will then deliver those goods to the importer. That scenario, I am going to say, would only be for very low value goods, so maybe imitation jewelry that needs to be sent, and it's not feasible to then spend more money with an express courier company for imitation jewelry. So then the next scenario would be where they do use the express courier company like DHL, FedEx, or UPS. And those three companies would collect the goods from overseas, bring the goods to Australia, do the customs clearance for the importer, and then let the importer know the taxes that need to be paid. The importer pays DHL, FedEx, or UPS the amount of money, and then one of those companies would then deliver the goods to the importer. So I refer to that as like a pipeline service or a door-to-door service, where those three companies will do A to B, and the types of goods that might go through the express courier network could be imitation jewelry, could be silver jewelry, gold jewelry, diamonds, all of the above. As the value gets higher, then the next stage would be as valuable cargo on a general air cargo plane. So, for example, a particular airline flying to Australia, there would be a safe on board, and then the jewelry is placed into the safe on board the aircraft, and then when the goods come into Australia, the goods are taken out of the safe on the aircraft and put into a safe at the air cargo terminal, and then a customs broker, someone like Platinum Freight, would do the customs clearance, and then the importer could then go to the air cargo terminal and collect their goods, because the goods would have been cleared and the taxes would have been paid. The fourth scenario would be where an importer travels to the overseas country, purchases the goods that they wish or need to purchase, and then before they board the plane to come to Australia, we would do the customs clearance, work out the taxes, bill the importer would pay us, and then we would then provide them with release papers, and then the importer would print those release papers while they are overseas, and then they would then show those papers to the Australian Border Force at the airport that they arrive at in Australia.
What are the benefits and potential drawbacks of using express carriers like DHL or FedEx for shipping jewellery to Australia? And how do these companies handle customs clearance?
So these three express courier companies, they specialize and they do a good job of moving goods from A to B and doing everything in between. So what that means is they will, as I mentioned, collect the goods from the overseas supplier, do the overseas customs clearance, bring the goods, transport the goods to Australia, undertake the Australian customs clearance, contact the importer to pay the taxes, and then deliver the goods. And usually this whole process could be done in, let's say, at a bare minimum, it could, if it's coming from a country close to Australia, the importer could have the goods within 2 days of the goods being shipped, possibly 3 days. So it is a short time frame express service for one price, excluding any taxes that need to be paid.
How does the process of sending jewellery as valuable cargo on an aircraft differ from using these express carriers?
So when jewelry or precious stones or gold bullion is coming to the country and it's in the safe on board the aircraft, again, it's a short time frame. It would be no longer than 24 hours in transit. Most of the time, we'd be talking maybe 8 to 14 hours in transit. So we would need to have customs cleared the goods before they arrive, because once those goods have been checked in at the air cargo terminal into their safety holding space, there are fees, and the fees are higher because these goods are considered valuable. And once the goods have been tax paid and released, then the importer would either collect the goods themselves or arrange security to go and collect the goods from the air cargo terminal.
What are the considerations for jewellers who choose to hand carry their goods from overseas to Australia? And how is the customs clearance process handled in these cases?
So it's not uncommon for jewelers to travel overseas and to see the goods that they're going to purchase and to be in the overseas jeweler's office or premise and to do the deal and to do the purchase. So they would fly from Australia to overseas, assess the goods they wish to purchase, decide which goods they're going to bring back to Australia, and then they would need to provide us with the commercial invoice for the goods that they have purchased. And then we would then need to submit this information to work out the tax, and then the importer would need to pay us so that we can pay the Australian Border Force the taxes that are payable. So, as you can imagine, having a customer overseas in a different time zone requires us to be available to some extent on their time zone. And we also need to be able to receive payment. We also need to be able to email them release papers. So again, this whole process needs to be completed quickly, and communication needs to happen at different hours of the day or night. That's one half of that scenario. The other half is where a lot of Australian importers or wholesalers will travel to trade fairs overseas. They'll then purchase the stock. They may have 5, 10, 15 different invoices from different suppliers, and then we need to put that information together, work out the tax, and then the importer would then again receive the release papers, and then they would then print those release papers and show them to the Australian Border Force when they arrive at whatever international airport that they will arrive into Australia, and then they can then leave the airport with the goods that they have purchased.
Before purchasing jewellery from overseas, why is it important to research if Australia has a free trade agreement with the country of origin, and how can this affect import duty rates?
So Australia has so many different free trade agreements with different countries, And just to name a few, maybe some of the most common free trade agreements that we have one with Singapore, have one with Japan, Korea, the USA. But some items that importers purchase, they don't have any import duty anyway. So for example, when Australian importers purchase items from overseas, some of the items that they will purchase may not even have any import duty. So for example, if an importer purchases diamonds, there is no import duty on diamonds at any stage. If they were to import precious stones or semi-precious stones or pearls, there are no import duty taxes on those items, regardless of what country they come from. But there is a 5% import duty on items. So when I use the word item, I mean like a necklace, a ring, a bracelet. So things that have been made from precious metals or metals and have stones or semi-precious stones or diamonds placed within the item, those scenarios will attract a 5% duty. So this is where the free trade agreement issue arises. And if you are purchasing items from a country that we have a free trade agreement with, and if those goods were made in that country, and if those goods would pay 5% duty, then a free trade agreement could reduce that 5% import duty down to zero, but you still need to pay the 10% import GST. So in our scenarios, in the customers that we have, we generally see that when diamonds arrive into the country, there's no issue about duty, so we don't need to worry about a free trade certificate. In more cases than not, when an importer imports gold jewelry, the gold jewelry would pay 5% duty because it's not eligible for a free trade certificate. But if a customer was bringing in silver jewelry, we find that there are countries that manufacture silver jewelry, and we would recommend to the importer that they ask their overseas supplier to provide a free trade certificate for those goods. And there's always a but, and so the but in this scenario is there's no point paying for a free trade certificate if the import duty is not going to be double the amount to purchase the free trade certificate. So if you're going to pay $100 to get a free trade certificate, but the duty is only going to be $100, then there's no real point to ask your overseas supplier to provide a free trade certificate, because it's just, I guess, pointless to try and do that. You're not going to save any money in that scenario. But if you were looking at a $5,000 import duty bill and you were bringing silver jewelry from a country that has a free trade agreement with Australia, then it does make sense to pay $100 to get that free trade certificate.
Now, you've mentioned the duty payment and GST payment with the ABF and what they focus on when importing jewelry. When it comes to the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, or the DAF, what are the concerns regarding wooden components in imported jewelry?
So it doesn't happen often, but it does happen where some importers, their line of stock, their line of sale, the items that they sell do contain timber or wooden components. So therefore, when those items arrive into the country, they may be inspected by DAF, and then DAF will then make certain that the jewelry is processed and clean and has no biosecurity risk, and then the goods can then be released.
Now, can you share some details about a case study where diamonds were hand carried from a trade fair overseas? What were the key steps and challenges involved in this process?
So we have a regular customer who will travel from Sydney to the trade fair, purchase the diamonds that they require for the projects that they're working on. And so what they would do is they would email us before they travel from Australia to let us know that there will be a customs clearance required. And then when they're a day or possibly, we always ask for at least 2 days notice. But before they travel back to Australia, they would email us the invoices for the diamonds that they purchased. We would submit those details, work out the GST, and then provide them with the release papers. They would either print the paperwork at the hotel or at the airport lounge overseas, and then they would then have that paperwork ready to show the Australian Border Force when they arrive.
Similarly, can you share details about a case where jewellery was hand carried from overseas to Australia? What made this case unique and how was it handled?
So we have regular customers, regular importers who will travel overseas. They will go overseas to purchase their gold jewelry, and then they could bring back 5 kilograms, 10 kilograms, 20 kilograms of gold jewelry. And then we would have the invoices, submit them for tax assessment, and then invoice the customer the 5% import duty and the 10% GST. And then the importer overseas would print that paperwork and then show the Australian Border Force when they arrive into the country. So the main difference between the two cases is the first one had no import duty scenario. The second scenario has import duty and GST. And then the third one, which I'll just briefly mention, is we also have exporters who travel from Australia to go to trade fairs or to visit potential customers overseas, and they will export their opals. So they'll have a large amount of opals with high value. They will leave from an Australian international airport, and we will do the export declaration number to allow the goods to depart Australia, because anything over 2,000 Australian dollars needs an export declaration number. And then that Australian exporter will do their business overseas, and then we will then also do a re-import clearance to Australia before they board the plane from overseas. And then the Australian exporter slash importer will print that re-import paperwork off and then show the Australian Border Force the re-import paperwork, and then they are then able to leave the airport when they arrive with their goods in their possession. And we do that scenario quite frequently. So while we have importers who bring items to the country, we also do have Australian businesses who take items out of the country to source business and then return with those goods in their possession.
Finally, can you share some tips or best practices for jewelers to ensure a smooth importing process and to avoid some common pitfalls?
It really does come down to communication, and it does come down to timing. So for in our if I reflect on how we do things, we always require at least 2 to 3 business days to make this happen. So when you think about the different time zones and the different hours, needing to be paid, needing to email release papers. 2 days doesn't take long before it evaporates. So that 2 to 3 day window allows us to make it happen smoothly. One pitfall or one misconception, and I'm not sure why some people have this misconception, but a lot of jewelers will depart Australia with gold bars and take those gold bars to a jeweler overseas. Then they will then return to Australia with gold jewelry. And for some reason, a lot of these jewelers think that the only value they need to declare to the Australian Border Force is the value of the manufacturing cost on the gold jewelry. So in a previous podcast, and I mentioned about what is the price of goods, and the price of goods, the price that Australian Border Force sets is what is the cost of the materials, what is the cost of the labor, what is the cost of any stones in the jewelry. So we have to calculate what is the value of the gold bars that left Australia, what is the value of the labor overseas, and what is the value of the stones. Put those three ingredients together, and then that will be the value of the goods when they return to Australia. And we've been doing jewelry customs clearances for 24 years, and we're members of the Jewelers Association of Australia. So we know how to do it correctly, but there's always going to be some people who want to do it a different way, and it's just not the right way. So I just want to say here that I don't know why they think they just have to pay tax on the labor, because as per the Customs Act 1901, we have to put those three ingredients together to work out what is the value of the goods. And I was about to close it off, but I'll just say it's not uncommon for the Australian Border Force to hold goods at the airport pending evaluation, and then the importer has to pay an independent valuer to have the goods valued, and whatever value that independent valuer places upon the goods is the value that the import duty and the import GST will need to be paid on.
Thanks for sharing your insights and tips, Peter. Now, to learn more about customs clearance and freight management services, visit platinumfreight.com.au.